When people think of extinct animals from long ago, they typically picture dinosaurs. But that's just a tiny part of the story. Dinosaurs lived during the Mesozoic era, which lasted from 252 to 66 million years ago. But our planet has been around for over 4 billion years, and life in some form or another has existed on Earth for nearly all of it. So there were many other creatures that roamed the world long before the first dinosaur hatched from its egg. And these beasts were just as diverse as the dinosaurs themselves. Take saber-toothed cats, for example. We typically imagine them as big, cat-like creatures with giant canines that would slash and dice their prey. But while we have found many fossils of large saber-toothed cats, there were also plenty of smaller ones. For example, in 2019, a fossil of a previously unknown species was unearthed in Siberia. It was only the size of a house cat, but it had those same iconic long fangs. Scientists believe this small saber-tooth was an ancestor to the larger cats that came after it. And according to lead researcher Dr. Dmitry Telnov, saber-tooth ancestors first appeared in the fossil record about 20 million years ago. Since then, they've appeared across the globe. Some were big, some were small, but all had one thing in common: those signature long teeth. But what were these teeth used for? According to Telnov, these cats likely hunted small rodents. But because they were so small, they couldn't take down bigger prey. So they chose to specialize in taking out rodents. Over time, though, the competition for rodents got fierce. Big cats like tigers and lions could easily snatch them up and quickly eat them. So the small saber-toothed cats had to find a way to adapt or die out. In response, they became ambush predators who tried to take down bigger prey. This required stronger jaws and longer fangs. Over millions of years, they grew to be much larger than their ancestors. Unfortunately for them, humans arrived on the scene. We hunted them and took over their territory. And by the end of the Pleistocene epoch, all of the saber-toothed cats were dead. But while saber-toothed cats dominated the late Pliocene and Pleistocene epochs, another group of animals was dominating the skies: the Teratorns. These gigantic birds are considered to be one of the largest flying creatures that ever lived. The largest of the bunch was the aptly named Pteriduni, which was capable of stealing the food of early humans. But while we typically picture them as humanoid birds with huge wings, scientists now think they looked more like condors. In fact, they were so similar to condors that at one point they were classified as part of the same family. But researchers have since reclassified them into their own group, called the Teratornathidae. They might not look quite as cool as the original version, but the new one is still pretty scary. That's because Teratorns had massive wingspans that reached up to 12 meters. And they weighed somewhere between 180 and 230 kilograms. With those stats, they could carry off prey weighing 70 kilograms or more. And unfortunately for early humans, that weight limit included humans. There were several species of Teratorns, but most lived in North America, where they soared through the skies from about 2 million to 11,700 years ago. Scientists aren't sure exactly how they went extinct, but they believe it had something to do with changing climates and the disappearance of their preferred food sources. But while Teratorns were soaring above the landscape, another large animal was stomping around below them: the woolly mammoth. Woolly mammoths were perfectly adapted for cold climates thanks to their thick coats and their large size. They could weigh up to 12,000 pounds and reach up to 4 meters tall at the shoulder. This made them easy to spot in the landscape, but it also helped protect them from attacks. After all, it's hard to sneak up on a 12,000 pounds elephant-like creature. But while woolly mammoths were mostly safe from predators, they weren't safe from us. Humans hunted them and stole their food, destroyed their habitat, and generally made their lives miserable. By the end of the last ice age, woolly mammoths had disappeared from mainland Europe and most of Asia. But isolated populations survived on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean and on the island of Santa Cruz in the Caribbean. Here, woolly mammoths were able to live undisturbed for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But eventually, these populations died out too, leaving no mammoths behind except for one living relative, the Asian elephant. But while mammoths were roaming the landscape, Another type of elephant was busy swimming underwater. It was called the Pythagorean sea monster, but don't let the name fool you. It wasn't a monster at all. In fact, it was an ancient whale that lived about 34 million years ago. It got its scary name from the Greek mathematician Pythagoras, because when its skeleton was first discovered in the 1800s, it was thought to be the biggest animal that ever lived. It was also thought to be a monster because its skull looked like a giant pair of pliers. But we now know that this ancient whale wasn't a monster at all. It was a bizarre-looking baleen whale that ate krill and small fish. Baleen whales use the baleen hanging from their upper jaw to filter out krill and small fish. And while modern-day baleen whales have fine, hair-like baleen, pygmy sea monsters had thick, flexible baleen attached to a pair of bony plates. This allowed them to strain out bigger prey than their modern-day counterparts. In fact, they were able to capture fish that were 1.5 meters long. While the pygmy sea monster isn't with us anymore, it left behind a few relatives, including the blue whale, the largest animal that ever lived. But while whales were swimming in the ocean, another type of sea creature was slowly slithering onto land. It was a reptile-like creature with long, thin legs, and a body that was flat from side to side. It was a type of reptile called a Pareiasaur, and it spent most of its life on land, even though it laid eggs in the water. Pareiasaurs were some of the first vertebrates to transition from water to land, and these weird-looking creatures dominated the shallow seas that surrounded the supercontinent Gondwana during the early Permian period. They were also some of the first tetrapods, which are four-legged vertebrates. But while their legs worked well on land, they weren't very good swimmers. So to get around in the water, they basically slithered on their bellies. Not exactly the most graceful movement, but it got the job done. They were around for about 20 million years, until they were wiped out by a mass extinction event that paved the way for the rise of the dinosaurs. But while Pareiasaurs were crawling around on land, another large animal was creeping through the trees. It was a type of primate called a Pithicus. Pithicus means monkey, ape, and these creatures really do look like a mix between a monkey and an ape. They were covered in thick, dark hair, and walked on two legs. They also had long arms and opposable thumbs, which made them great climbers. They lived in Africa for at least 7 million years, but their fossils haven't been found anywhere else. And that's a shame, because Pithecus were incredibly diverse. At one point, they split into two groups, and each group split into two additional groups, and each of those groups split into two more groups, and you get the idea. By the time the Pithicus arrived on the scene, there were at least 8 different species alive at the same time. Sadly, they were all wiped out by the first of 3 major mass extinctions. But before they died out, they left behind a few descendants, including the modern-day apes and humans. But while humans were busy evolving in Africa, another strange creature was crawling along the bottom of the ocean. It was a relative of the starfish called a blastoid. Blastoids were echinoderms, which means they were closely related to sea urchins and starfish. But unlike those animals, they were attached to the seafloor for most of their lives. They also didn't have any distinct head or tail region, so they looked pretty much the same no matter how you slice them. But while they might not have had heads, they did have mouths that were surrounded by 5 symmetrical plates. They used these mouths to munch on algae growing on rocks. And since they were stuck in one place, they had to grow a tough exterior to protect them from being crushed by passing sea creatures. While blastoids are still with us today, they're nowhere near as diverse as they once were. In fact, there are only about 200 species alive today, compared to over 1,000 that existed during the Devonian period. But while blastoids were stuck on the seafloor, another large animal was busy exploring the skies. It was an insect called a Meganeura. Meganeuropsis is Greek for big insect. And as the name suggests, these insects were absolutely huge. One species had a wingspan that reached up to 43 centimeters, which was about the size of a crow's. But Meganeurons weren't crows. They were more like dragonflies. And like dragonflies, they were active predators. But while modern-day dragonflies chased down mosquitoes and other small insects, Meganeurons targeted other large insects. They had enormous compound eyes that gave them excellent vision, which helped them spot prey from far away. They also had strong, spiny legs that they used to grab onto their prey. But while Meganeurons were fierce predators, they didn't last very long. They lived from about 300 to 250 million years ago, but we don't know exactly why they went extinct. But it probably had something to do with the mass extinction event that marked the end of the Permian period. This event wiped out about 70% of all species on Earth, and it also wiped out all of the Meganeurons. These are just a few examples of the many large animals that roamed the Earth before the dinosaurs ever showed up. To learn more about the megafauna that roamed North America specifically, check out the series Primeval North America in the description below. What's your favorite prehistoric beast? Let me know in the comments. And thank you for watching.